So we're very thankful and excited about this panel. We have not just practitioners, but well-known and respected and award-winning practitioners at this panel. I will be not moderating. I will be just introducing the moderator of the panel, who will lead the discussion and the Q&A for this session. I was very pleased that Ricardo Trotti accepted our invitation to participate in this year's workshop. I think as all of you know, this award-winning journalist has been working on the issue of press freedom for quite a long time. He is director of the Press Institute and Press Freedom at the Inter-American Press Association. He is a blogger, he's a visual artist, he's a man of many talents, it seems. But more than anything, he shows and has demonstrated a true commitment to the issue of freedom of the press, freedom of expression. And so again, I'm very grateful that he's agreed to lead this important panel of important journalists on the topic of what it is, and what are the challenges we're reporting on and in Latin America. So Ricardo, thank you again so much for joining us, and I'll turn the mic over to you.
Thank you very much, Frank. Good morning. Just an announcement, Frances Robles from the New York Times just canceled. She has another commitment. She has to work as a journalist, so we excuse her. First of all, I want to thank FIU, the organizers, Frank and Dean Raul Reyes for inviting me to be part of this panel with such prominent journalists. I won't go into details about their bios in order to save time and to have a better Q&A session at the end, but I do want to stress that all of them, they are very well recognized because of their work and professional values. And during this panel, we would like to address two main subjects that we had been discussing with the panelists. First, the difficulties of working in a politicized and polarized Latin America, where some governments sell the idea, like Carlos said, that media and journalists are political parties of the opposition meant to minimize democracy. And Raul Reyes was talking about, where new regulations and press laws are created to minimize the watchdog role of journalism. So I will ask Claudia Gurisatti, the director of NTN 24, a TV network recently censored by the government of Venezuela, as you might know, to tell us a story and the strategy that she followed to keep informing their audiences. And I'm also asking Mario Diament, a professor here, an associate professor here at FIU, and columnist in his home country, Argentina, my country too, to talk about the difficult environment that the Latin American press is facing due to what we have been saying before in the last speech by Carlos Lauria, to new populist governments. The other problem we want to address is the relationship between the US press, the American press, and Latin America. After the economic crisis, many media companies decreased their coverage in the region. Many foreign correspondents were let go or relocated to other regions of the world. And the good journalism being carried out in Latin America suffered, and perhaps due to this, the region issues became background to Washington's agenda. I will invite Carlos Dada of El Faro, El Salvador. He's the director. It's a new digital and investigative media company, to give us his point of views. Perhaps the foreign press was left with an outdated image of Central America, reflecting the old days that we know about the Civil War. But nowadays, the issues are totally different in Latin America. And we also have Tim Padgett of the National Public Radio affiliated to South Florida, who will comment on the situation and whether the American press should look south or follow Washington focus to the east, to Russia, Crimea, Iraq, Afghanistan, or how the US journalists need to adapt to the new reality of Latin America. And of course, because of the question that have arisen before, taking into consideration also that the Hispanic audience in America, in the United States, is increasing and asking for a greater coverage of issues relating to their home countries. And of course, I want to ask them all to discuss whether they believe this is a simple matter of resource allocation for the American press, or if the media should be responsible for its lack of interest in the region. So first, let me ask Claudia Gurisatti to talk about the censorship she and NTN24 suffer in Venezuela.
Thank you, Ricardo. Gracias por la invitación para NTN24.
For NT24, for us it is an honor to be this morning with you, sharing our experience. And quickly, NT24 is an
Internacionales en español muy enfocado en el
Spanish focused in the covering of the publishing of our countries of Latin America. Its focus is very clear of what happens in each of our countries. We have a team of journalists, more or less 70 persons of all Latin American nations covering in each of the countries, also in our Center of News in Bogota and Washington and New York. It's a project of RNC TV, a very big TV chain in Colombia. We were born 5 years ago with the interest of being able to share the universal topics of the region, to join and get together with that, and the news of each country pass them to the other neighboring countries. In this context, we can say that NT24 was born just when socialism of the 21st century was born. And in this polarization of the region, we have been working. We have been witnesses with our journalists in the streets of our countries of many examples of how democracies can strengthen themselves, and also democracies can they lessen. One of these cases is Venezuela, the lack of improvement, and the media. This is minimum to consider ourselves democracies, because this has been constant in our journalist task. It has inevitable to be able to talk and report about what was happening, and I am talking about this because it is important to know under what context we are moving, the context under which the separation of powers, minimums of the democracy, is more complex, is less existence. The dependency of the powers like justice, of the executive power, the lack of improvement of the rights and civil rights, and among them the right to free press and the opinion and the differentiation and dissidence. And I'm going to cite Enrique Krauss. I'm going to quote him. He's a Mexican. When he refers to the topic of the public truth in Venezuela, how, in the measure in which the Venezuelan government has been closing media that were traditional always, how he was censoring the media that he could not control, how he had bought other means that he could not have under its control, and how that public truth is limiting to the official truth only. And in that sense, Enrique Krauss says the public truth is lacks of improvement and deteriorates so much that becomes a public distortion when the one that thinks differently doesn't find a microphone, when the one that criticizes doesn't have a media to talk, when he demands to the government he doesn't have a means of being listened, and the public truth, it diminishes to the minimum expression. Under this context, NT24 lived, and the last February we were covering the first protest that happened in Venezuela after a few years, which was called the White March, where a lot of students that spontaneously were organizing themselves. We went to the streets, and they took the streets of Caracas and also in other regions of the Venezuela to march and complain, and you have a team of NT24 covering what was happening at that moment. Of course, also in the channel we were presenting what we called the red tide, which all these people that support Nicolás Maduro, the inheritor of Chavez, and when that destabilization happened, that happened in February, that was a month and a half ago, motorized people or people in motorcycles came, that they were considered part of the revolutionary collectives and organizations that are armed. They have a lot of weapons. When apparently the government needs them, they come out to generate chaos. And violence starts. Unfortunately, there are 3 dead, and this is the afternoon, and we're transmitting in the afternoon when the signal of NT24 in Venezuela starts disappearing from the screens of TVs in this Latin American country. NT24 is a channel by subscription, by cable, and the satellite means they turned off our signal, so the operators communicate with us and tell us that the government gave the order to turn off our signal. With Tele, which is the communications that sent the order that said that the signal of NT24 has to come out of air. And that's what it happened. Ricardo, that's the history in a summary. While we, and I say it because I know about it, we reported what was happening that day in Venezuela. All the media of communications that were local were sending entertaining programs, soap operas, concerts. Nobody was finding out what was happening. NT24 became then the change of Global Vision, the last critical channel, or the last channel that criticized the government, a little window where the microphone was given to the opposition in Venezuela, the only means that they had in Venezuela. They not only reported on the national chains when the official people talk, and we also looked for the opposition, and our signal was taken off, and we are trying obviously to use all the political and judicial ways so that sometime we go back into the air. It's very difficult. We don't see it's going to be probable now at present, because with the radicalization and the determination of the government to shut up all the opposition voices, it's going to be very difficult when it's a means that gives opportunity to the opposition. Claudia, can I ask you a question? Understanding a situation like this, the journalist in a censored channel, that they have mechanisms of self-defense among the professionals, and they end, perhaps, they are activists against the government. How a director like you do to maintain the coherence to report and the strategy of looking for alternative channels? How do you deal with a group of journalists that find themselves that they're being attacked? Well, several ways. The first, obviously, is to have very clear that our objective is to report, underline this permanently. That what happens is, as you point out, the circumstances are deteriorate, and the journalists feel that he is part of a war. Well, he can start acting in the middle of that war. But if you feel what are the principles of the information and democratic principles are, then the path is open. Journalism should also be a critical journalism. And when the democratic values are deteriorated, I believe that the objectivity alone does not exist. It is impossible that objectivity exists when you have to report in the middle of deterioration of the minimum values. And I'm talking about the minimum democratic values. Of course, the journalist also becomes a reporter of what is happening to him. So what is the lie? Not to become an activist, not to lose sight that your position is to report In NT, we don't have a channel, but we have the social networks, the digital ways. We keep on generating news for the Venezuelans, strengthening this, enlarging the space for the people that generate this news, and generating dominions in the web platforms and the digital platforms, because the government also tries to hack those dominions, gives the order of closing them. So immediately what we do is to progress towards another domain, report through the social networks of Twitter so people read how to become an activist. We have to fight with this every day, because when you feel that you're attacked, of course you are the defender of your own right, especially that there are journalists on the other side that handle an agenda of propaganda of a government that is continually attacking the other journalists. So before the attack of the journalists that they received from other journalists in T24 and from the government, is there an additional conflict there for the journalists? True? Yes, of course, because there's a security problems also. The journalists cannot go to the street with it, and those jackets to protect from bullets and helmets and all this protection. But if you find out what is the role of the journalist, you don't lose the role. They are part of an officialist way of the propaganda and doctrine. So these journalists are really working for a way of how they see the society or a system that is away from the democratic. But when we are registered and the journalists are registered and we have clear that our task is to promote the democratic values, because when you promote the democratic values, we are generating the space to be able to report freely. So I think that we could establish the difference. The risk is there. It's impossible that the journalist that is attacked doesn't demand his rights. But there is something that is also key, and we ask the redaction to ask for it. We not only have rights, we also have responsibilities and tasks and duties. And in situations in which the democratic values are deteriorated, one of those tasks is to denounce that with no fear. If you allow me, Claudia, and then afterwards we can continue with NT24. I think tenemos
For the other topic that we want to discuss with Mario Diament. As you know, Mario is from Argentina. He knows very well what's going on in our country, especially because right now we have also a populist government that, like was said before, this is a problem we are facing in Latin America in so many different countries, where the press is being accused of being part of the opposition or trying to minimize the democracy. So Mario, if you please.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. I want to start by saying that it's never been easy to be a reporter or a journalist in Latin America. I developed most of my career in the 70s under one of the most brutal military dictatorships, which is a great school to understand how to really, what is the function of journalism, and more important than that, how to survive. Because in what was particularly the Southern Cone in the 70s, survival was one of the most important conditions that you faced as a journalist. We never had official censorship in Argentina. The way that the government applied censorship was by killing you. And therefore, the problem was taken off. In the newspaper where I worked, was called La Opinión. I was the managing editor before being foreign editor and also a reporter. 10% of a newsroom of almost 400 journalists was killed. They were called disappeared. Never heard of. So And still we had a function to cover, and the function was to find ways to communicate what was going on without conflicting frontally with the government. So as I said, it was a great school, and also a way that later on, when democracy came back to Argentina, to understand the importance of what we were doing, the importance of journalism in a democratic society. Something very different is happening nowadays, not only in Argentina, but in a group of countries that were perfectly described by Carlos Lauria, that went the way of populism, meaning kind of sort of left-wing politics, but mostly populism, that it's easily confounded with fascism and less with ideas of socialism. The press, because of the lack of a strong opposition, became the main target of the government. Actually, they selected two. First was the judiciary, and then the press, the two institutions that can or could really challenge the freedom of the government to do whatever they wanted. And the case of Argentina is particularly interesting because it's unique in a sense. The government selected one newspaper, Clarín, one of the strongest newspapers in the Spanish-speaking world, as the main target, as the main enemy. I don't have any recollection of something of the sort having happened ever before, that a conglomerate, a media conglomerate, is selected as the devil, the enemy, and the CEO of this company, which was a guy who was always interested in having no figuration at all, became the target and the devil of this government, to the extent that officials of the government would go to international meetings carrying T-shirts and mugs with the lettering Clarín miente, Clarín lies. We had something of the sort in Miami, for those who have some memory, when the Cuban National Foundation attacked the Miami Herald with signs in the buses that says, the Herald lies. But at least this was an organization, and it wasn't the government itself. The effect of the emergence of these populist governments, which emerged with public support. They won elections. In Argentina, the last election was won with 54% of the electorate, despite all the opposition of the press, which means and explains something of the relative importance of the press to affect electoral results, is that it divided the society. And I think that we can find that in most of the countries that were mentioned as having populist government, including Venezuela. There is such a bridge between these two societies, the ones who support the populist government and the one who opposed it, that it has affected the functioning of families, of friends. It has divided the waters to such an extent that people don't talk to each other. But most important, the intense propaganda of the government against the press and trying to instill in people the notion that the independent press doesn't exist. There is no such a thing as an independent press. That the existing so-called independent press is actually a press that responds to economic interest of specific groups, and therefore they are not independent. That this so-called independent press expresses not their independent opinions of the reporters and journalists, but expresses the interest of the companies that, whom they work. This notion that was pushed by the government has, I must say, convinced a great part of the population, particularly in Argentina. I had meetings with students of journalism in Buenos Aires, young people, intelligent people, and when we were discussing the role of the press as a kind of supervisor of the freedoms, the question always came from them, asking who supervises the press. And that notion is a result of the intense campaign that the government made, and I would say succeeded in creating that notion that the press is only a function of economic interest. If you have a whole generation of young people in their 20s that is almost convinced that there is no such a thing as an independent press, that there is no respectful function of media in a democratic country, I hardly can see how a new government or a new system can really modify this strong conviction that you can find everywhere. I don't know to what extent this happens in Venezuela, but I can say that this happens in countries like Argentina, it happens in certainly in Ecuador, it happens to a certain extent in Brazil. And I would also invite those who occupy themselves of analyzing the role of the press in Latin America to think to what extent the press is also responsible for its own demise in this situation, because in Latin American countries where the owners of the press undoubtedly played political roles, they supported, like in Argentina, military regimes without exercising that need of defending the democratic values. In a way, they created their own demise. As I said, they created their own weakness that now these populist governments are attacking.
Mario, let me ask you, before moving to the other subject of this panel, it seems to me that the problem you're describing about government, populist government versus the press versus journalists and freedom of the press, it's an internal matter of discussion in Latin America, but it's not going further. It's not going to the agenda of Europe. It's not part of the agenda of the United States. The US government and the press of the US is more focusing in Latin America with other issues like narco-trafficking, but not focusing on the promotion of democracy, which is, and which freedom of the press is an important part of that. Why do you think that's a lack of interest of those governments? The press in these countries are not playing a good role about explaining the public what's going on in Latin America?
Well, one thing we must admit is the press has lost an enormous amount of power, what we call the conventional press, newspapers, television, because there is such a diversity of opinions nowadays.
You're talking about the American press.
Everywhere. And the example that the government won the election with 54% in Argentina, despite the intense campaign of the opposition press, it shows that the relative influence of the press in the public opinion. So I think that in a way, Latin America it's one of the last resorts where there is a certain dependence on the conventional press. In Egypt, the press didn't play any role. It was the social media that provoked, in a way, the revolution in Egypt and in most Middle Eastern countries. And in the United States, the conventional press, except maybe television, also is losing not only power, it's losing, it's ceasing to exist. So I think that this obsession that the governments in Latin America have with the press is because, in a way, that's my opinion, the press in those countries represents the only form of opposition because the opposition doesn't exist.
Thank you, Mario. Well, I believe we have a very good introduction to move to the other topic of this panel, which was try to understand a little bit more the relation between the U.S. press with Latin American and the Caribbean. And especially we invited Carlos Dada, who is the co-founder of one of the most important investigative digital sites in Latin America, which is from El Salvador, El Faro. But instead of talking about his issues, we want to hear him about what he thinks about the coverage of Latin American by the foreign press. And if really Central America especially is very well portrayed by the US press or the European press. Carlos?
Really? Hello, everybody. Thanks for coming this morning, and to FIU, thanks for inviting me. Thank you, Ricardo. I must apologize for my English. If you don't understand something, just please let me know. Can you hear me? Yes? Yeah, okay. I'm still thinking about the two introductions and about what you were saying. I was just remembering 2002, and I'm sorry, I'm going to be back to the subject really soon, Ricardo. I couldn't stop remembering that during the 2002 coup d'etat against Chavez in Venezuela, what we now call the opposition media was also playing soap operas and cartoon programs. I think the relationship with media and power in Latin America has also been more a matter of political interests than a matter of what we should focus the discussion on, which is the citizens' right to know. This has never been part of the discussion. It has always been, as Mr. Diament was saying, how free is media? And we talk about media, not about journalism, which is the other thing that I'm always very curious about. During the 80s, most Latin American countries were governed by military regimes. Right-wing military regimes, as opposed to Venezuelan military regime, which is now a leftist regime. During those years, most of Latin American media, or what we would call now traditional media, were playing an active role supporting those military regimes. All over the region. In El Salvador, it was El Diario de Hoy actively publishing things against any progressive minds opposed to the regime, actually financing death squads from the newspaper. Or in Chile, it was El Mercurio supporting the Pinochet regime and even publishing fake news in order to play a political agenda. This is how the region has lived. During the 80s in my country, the way to know what was going on was reading US media. A brilliant generation of American journalists started their careers or practiced their careers in my country, in El Salvador. Mm-hmm. And that's how we still now know what happened then. Because if we relied on our media, then we would never know what really happened during the war years. And I truly believe that journalism practiced by US journalists in El Salvador during the 80s was the most influential information for policymakers in the United States. Fast forward to last week. March 9th, we had a very close election, presidential election in El Salvador. A former guerrilla commander from the FMLN won over an Arena candidate. Arena is still the right-wing party in El Salvador. Both parties, Arena and the FMLN, come straight from the war. Both are institutions that were born in the war and for the war in the 80s. And they still maintain this narrative because it's very convenient for their political interests. In the days previous to that election, here in the United States, you could hear voices even from the US Congress and of course from some lobbying organizations, especially here in Miami, asking the US government to warn Salvadoran citizens against voting for a communist, for a former guerrilla commander. Of course, this is part of a political agenda, but I also think it's a very provincial expression, right, that illustrates the lack of knowledge about how the region has transformed and how our problems have completely changed. I must say, in a personal note, that me and several other Salvadoran journalists, we consider ourselves like direct heirs, is that the word, herederos? Heirs of those brilliant foreign journalists or foreign press corps that covered our country during the 80s. But then after the war, the whole Central America went to an invisibilization process in the US media. So no one knows what happened there. Right? No one knows what happened there. Of course, no one but us. So right now, when you start receiving again news about the region, people here tend to read it under the same narrative from what the last thing they knew about my region, which was a very, very cruel conflict between the communists and the military regime. So let me tell you what's been going on in Central America while you were looking to the other side. Democracy came to the region, and it came for real. And besides the natural problems that are inherent to, I would say, any newborn democracies, it is growing, I would say, in a healthy way. The fact that we had such a close election, just 0.222 is the margin of difference between the winner and the second place, and that this was not solved with blood on the streets, but through institutionality, even for the losing party, proves that our democracy is strengthening, it's getting stronger, it's growing in a very healthy, and I would even say in a very fast way, if you take into account that the peace agreements were just signed in 1992. Still, this democracy has not been able to solve most of our problems as societies. Which problems are those? First, of course, there's poverty and the lack of economic growth, the lack of possibilities for most of the population to aspire for a decent life. We've had 20 years of Arena governments, that means the extreme right, and we have 5 going for another 5 of FMLN governments, meaning the extreme left. None of them has been able to solve these issues. And then, of course, there's what I would say are main problems, which are violence and organized crime. The war is over, but 2 things remain from those years, from my point of view: violence and impunity. Those are the things that remain in place from those years. Though it's not a political violence anymore, El Salvador, and I would say Central American Northern Triangle, Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador, is the most violent region in the world. And as you know, the other problem is that now Central America has also become the main corridor for drugs from South America to the United States. A new problem, this drug trafficking, these cartels invading our region, invading a region whose states are fragile enough to be totally unable to confront these organizations. How do we face this? The March election was covered by the New York Times from a desk in Mexico City. Although it was a very good story written by Elizabeth Malkin, who is a woman with a lot of knowledge about the region. The New York Times is not even sending anybody down there for this election. So forget about the rest of the problems. 3 weeks ago, there was a story, a Newsweek magazine front page story about Honduras and who's fighting your drug war. That's how the story was called, and there was a portrait of a Honduran soldier. I think it was a shock for most of the people that read that story. Because most of the American public have no idea of how the war against drugs is being fought on the terrain, because no one's going there anymore. So now you just hear that there's this thing happening, but no one knows exactly how it is happening, how it is eroding all our democratic institutions. It's a poor state with a lot of impunity, with a lot of violence, and with a lot of corruption. And then you have the drug cartels. That's how fragile the situation is right now on the land. Add to that the gangs' violence. How do they exert their violence? They control a lot of territories where the state can't reach. So they basically rule. Tens of thousands of Central Americans live now under the rule of those gang members.
Gangs increasing by deported immigrants from the United States too, right?
Yes, of course, Ricardo. And I think we have to be careful about this, so not to create a cartoon, and I try to be very careful about this. Not even most of the deportees are gang members, but gangs started in El Salvador when gang members were deported from Los Angeles, because gangs were born in California. And then you have the great cocktail. I mean, if you start deporting gang members that were raised in the streets of California in the 80s, and then you put them back in El Salvador in the 90s, you know what's going to happen. You have a lot of impunity, you have a lot of weapons, you have a lot of dysfunctional families, and you have a lot of kids aiming to have power in a very violent culture, because if war does something for societies, it's to install a culture of violence. Then you have the perfect cocktail. And now you have the problem, 20 years after that, the problem that no one saw coming, because we were more worried about installing democracy and consolidating institutions. And now gangs are responsible of most of the homicides in the Northern Triangle of Central America. Impunity. The few studies we have, because academia also suffered from those years, point to more than 90% of impunity. That means if you kill a human being, you have around more than 90% of chances to get away with it. This sounds like very alarming, right? Well, let me tell you more. I think we have not lost everything thanks to that impunity. Why? Because our prison system is overcrowded more than 300%. Imagine if the justice system really worked. In terms of putting in prison every single person guilty of those crimes, right? We don't have anywhere to put them anymore. If you go to prisons, then you would understand how our society is so dysfunctional. I don't want to tell you stories about prisons because we don't have time and they're really, really long stories. But prisons are controlled by the prisoners, not by the state. Gang leaders operate from the prison, which, by the way, allows me to tell you one thing. One of the most frequent questions we receive is why gangs on the streets still obey to some guys that are in prison, right? Which makes sense. Why would you obey the orders from some guy that can't even reach you because he's imprisoned? Right? The answer is because if you are a gang member, sooner or later, you'll end up in prison too, and he rules the prison. Let me go fast forward. So there are these continuous problems since the war years, violence and impunity. And then you have the other question for us, especially for us. How do we tell these stories to our society? How do we serve the communities where we exercise our journalism? We have found that the best way to do this is through long-format journalism, investigative journalism, narrative journalism. Right? But these are, of course, the main victims of the media crisis all over, right? In most of what we would call traditional media, the first bureaus or parts of the newsroom that are being closed are those dedicated to investigative journalism or long-format journalism because it's the most expensive journalism. So right now, and this is the good news, a lot of investigative journalists out of traditional media have found a way through online journalism to still work on their themes. More than that, they have found that they can do it in a much more, let's call it, independent way. Going back to the beginning, not having to obey to the political agendas of the families that own traditional media in Latin America. So I would say that right now, online journalism is thriving with some of the best journalism being made in Latin America, all over Latin America. The downside to this is that online journalism is also the place where some of the worst journalism I've ever read is being done.
Carlos, let me get back to you afterwards with the question. No, that's perfect.
Yes.
But I just want to stick to the exceptional portrait you made about Central America being visioned by this part of the world 20 years ago and what's going on right now. So that's a perfect introduction for Tim. We asked him to speak a little bit about the environment of the U.S. press to cover Latin America, and because of the problems and the different economic crises that the press had been facing in this country, but especially to let us know if he thinks that the coverage of Latin America is also a lack of interest or lack of responsibility by the U.S. press.
Well, thanks, Ricardo. I'd like to sort of start off the discussion with a sort of tongue-in-cheek question, if I may, or maybe it's not so tongue-in-cheek, and that question is, do Latin American drug cartels treat U.S. correspondents today with more respect than Latin American governments do? And I asked this because a few years ago, when I was still the Latin America bureau chief for Time magazine, I was doing some reporting in Culiacan, which in the northwest part of Mexico, and Culiacan is sort of ground zero for drug trafficking in Mexico. It's the capital of the Sinaloa cartel, and one of the things that I often do when I go into places like that is I like most U.S. correspondents, I seek out some of the other journalists who are covering this on a day-to-day basis. And one of the best there are the editors and the investigative reporters for a publication called Rio 12 in Culiacan. They do very good work. That also makes them very big targets, unfortunately, for the Sinaloa cartel and even their rivals. And so one night I took one of the editors out for dinner, and we went out to, he wanted to go to an outdoor cafe. And as we're eating, he's telling me about what a target he has become because of his work. And I, of course, asked him then, why the hell did you invite me to an outdoor cafe? And he says, oh, don't worry about it. As long as I'm with you, I'm okay. I said, what do you mean by that? He says, well, I mean, look, they would love to get rid of me, but they don't care about you guys. You guys just come in, you parachute in here for a few days, you do your reporting. Nobody here reads you. You're innocuous to them in many respects. So as long as I'm here with you tonight, I'm safe. My initial reaction was, okay, fine, I'm very pleased to be your human shield tonight, so you can have a dinner al fresco. But on the other thing I thought was, geez, I wonder why I don't get this much consideration from the Felipe Calderon government, who at that time was just really freezing out U.S. journalists in Mexico because they were so upset with the fact that we were actually covering the drug war. They thought that we were going overboard with it. They thought that we were painting a picture of Mexico as just a violent war zone. They couldn't understand why we weren't doing more stories about the big tourism push in Mexico. And it made it very difficult for us to get access, which was very a different situation for U.S. correspondents as compared to, say, the 20th century in Mexico and Latin America. If you were a correspondent for Time, Newsweek, New York Times, LA Times, Wall Street Journal, really, in most places in Latin America, all you had to do was pick up the phone, and you got access. If you wanted an interview with a head of state, you could get it if you represented a U.S. media outlet. There was this sense that Latin American leaders needed to talk to you as the conduit to Washington, to the U.S. public. That was the 20th century. In the 21st century, there has been a big change, a big sea change, for two factors, and this has made it much more difficult, I think, for U.S. correspondents to cover Latin America. One of the big changes was the boom in political and economic confidence and autonomy on the part of Latin American governments, particularly when you look at a place like Brazil. There's this feeling in the 21st century that Latin American countries really no longer feel so, they've cut the umbilical cord in a way to the United States. The other then that has sort of followed from this is this rise, as we've been talking about, of populist governments that are largely anti-U.S., and they're not always leftist, I would point out. I mean, all I have to do is point to the Calderon government. They can be liberal or conservative, but there's been this rise of leadership in Latin America that is finally feeling itself free of the shadow of the United States. And one of the things they love to do, they get a thrill these days out of telling the U.S. media, no. They love to put us in our place. And I'm not per se condemning that. What I'm just saying is that this has created a very different environment for U.S. correspondents to work in. And it's something that we have to adjust to. And one of the things that's exacerbated it is it's a vicious cycle. As Washington and the White House looks at Latin America and sees Latin America as sort of becoming more independent of the United States, Washington then sort of has taken on this attitude. And Frank, tell me if I'm wrong, but I mean, and I know you are not part of this mindset, but there, in the Beltway, there's been this feeling in the past decade or so that, well, Latin America doesn't need us that much anymore, so why should we really be that interested in Latin America? Despite the fact that you've got issues like the drug war, trade, immigration, all these very important issues that should have Washington engaged more than ever with Latin America, but sadly that isn't the case. So there's this sort of mutual disengagement between Latin America and Washington that has left U.S. correspondents in the hemisphere in a sort of limbo that, as I said, has sort of decreased our access and really forced us to, as I said, adjust to a new reality. I would look to Venezuela, for example, as being one of the prominent examples. It has forced us to not take these countries and these governments so much for granted. We have to do a little bit more work to try to figure out what it is that these governments want to convey. You know, in the past, it used to be we just knock on the door, so we want an interview with the president, and this is what we want to talk about. Well, now we have to learn a lot more about what they want to talk about. That's particularly true with countries like Brazil. And again, it's not just the radical leftists that have presented this situation for us. It's even the more moderate leftist governments like Brazil, like Bachelet in Chile, et cetera. They're much more skeptical of the U.S. press today. They are forcing us to learn a hell of a lot more about what they want to convey to the world rather than what it is we want to convey about them. And this polarized, politicized situation we talk about makes it even worse because even if you do the work and you get an interview with Hugo Chavez, I got at least 2 interviews with Chavez when he was president because I feel like I did concentrate on making this adjustment, but there was a cost to pay for this because if you did get an interview with Hugo Chavez, he and his people expected you then to become their propagandist. And when you didn't become their propagandist, you caught holy hell. I remember my last interview with Chavez was in 2006, right after he called George W. Bush the devil at the UN. And I happened to be in New York at the time. They asked me to come interview him because they had to do damage control because of that. Well, we did the interview. It all went well. But then I just went on practicing the same kind of journalism on Venezuela that I always have. And when the government needed, to be criticized, I criticized it. Well, the torrent of angry emails I got from the Venezuelan embassy in Washington, from Foreign Affairs and Caracas Ministry, et cetera. I became public enemy #1 of the Chavez government because I had betrayed them because I didn't become their propagandist as my way of saying thank you for being given access to Chavez. And again, this is not just a leftist thing. You got the same thing from conservative governments like Calderón in Mexico, most recently Martinelli in Panama. It's this idea that that Latin America is now feeling its confidence, and we no longer need U.S. correspondents. And if you do get access, you're going to have to play our game. And that's one of the drawbacks to, as I said before, one of the benefits of this is that it's forcing U.S. correspondents, again, to, I think, learn a lot more deeply than we used to about what it is that Latin American governments are trying to get, what Latin American countries are all about and what they want to tell the world rather than what we want to say about them. But there is that drawback that they're trying to force us to pander to them. Again, Calderón's people, Calderón's communications apparatus in Los Pinos during that time was probably one of the worst I've ever seen in Latin America. And they would actually tell you things, well, like if you want access to this government official, whatever, we would like to see an article about our push on tourism. And you would just say, what? I mean, seriously? It was very explicit. But then again, look at what's going on today with Mexico. The Peña Nieto government has learned, this lesson as well. If you want access to Peña Nieto, we better start seeing headlines like Aztec Tiger. We better start seeing a lot less focus from your media outlet about the drug war and a lot more about Peña Nieto reforms, like the oil reform, which are momentous. But this idea that we have to just forget about the drug war because the Peña Nieto government would rather focus on oil reform is obviously absurd. And what most Latin governments are now telling U.S. correspondents to do is what the Cuban government has been forcing us to do for decades, which is pander a little bit too much in order to get visas. For example, and if any U.S. correspondent tells you that he doesn't pull punches, that he or she doesn't pull punches in order to get the journalist visa to get into Cuba, they're bald-faced lying to you, okay? Every U.S. correspondent pulls punches in some way or other about the Cuban government in order to get those coveted journalist visas. I have not been let into Cuba in 11 years now, because in 2003, I made the mistake of interviewing some dissidents at a time in Cuba when Fidel was throwing them all in jail back in 2003, if you remember. In 2008, I thought I was going to get one, and I was sort of keeping quiet about Cuba, because that's the way you get a visa, right? You kind of fly under the radar. But then one day I couldn't stand it anymore. I saw in Grandma that Fidel had written a letter that was essentially contradicting something Raul had said the day before. So I committed the most egregious sin. I wrote an article saying that Fidel was disagreeing with Raul. And I got a call from the intersection in Washington saying, "You can't say that." I said, "I didn't say it, Fidel said it." I said, "Well, it doesn't matter. You're not getting your visa." So, you know what? It was the most liberating experience I've ever felt, because I could just go ahead and write whatever the hell I want to write now about Cuba. And if I need some on the ground reporting, I just send in a stringer, who can tell me what's going on there. But that's the kind of pandering now that I think Latin American governments in general, not just Cuba, want U.S. correspondents to do, and that's a big challenge. For us, because and I think it's bad for the domestic journalism scene, because if we're pandering, if the great U.S. media apparatus is pandering, that makes, I think, the domestic journalists even more vulnerable, because it tells the Latin American governments that if they can keep us in check that way, then they can do pretty much whatever they want with their local media, and as we've been seeing with all the anti-defamation laws and things like that have already been discussed, so I won't go into it. So I think one of the things U.S. correspondents, we have to do is we just have to keep pushing. We can't buy into this political polarization. We have to be pan-critical, as I would call it, particularly things like the Venezuelan crisis right now. It is so easy to try to turn this into a heroic side, evil side. You've got to be pan-critical. You've got to tell the story of the human rights violations by the Maduro government, but you also got to tell the story about how this protest movement is really not going to go anywhere until the opposition movement finds a way to win the Venezuelan poor over to its side. That's the way you develop the kind of credibility that's going to make it harder for governments like Venezuela's to tag us as the great, the tools of the great Northern Empire that the Chavistas always want to get us on. And then my final point would be the point that Ricardo was making about, should we then, in our despair, should U.S. journalists then just give up on Latin America and follow Washington as it moves to Asia? And those issues, well, my response to be that way, we can't do that, because if you're a good journalist, you realize that Washington can't really make that move to Asia without Latin America. When you look at things like the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the Pacific Alliance between Colombia and the countries on the Pacific coast of Latin America, these things are just too much joined at the hip. And I think that's how we sort of stay in the game in Latin America as U.S. journalists, is we point out those things, not just to U.S. readers, but to Latin American governments, that we get it, that Latin America is part of Washington's push to Asia, and I think that will make then Latin American governments more disposed to working with us, and they'll start treating us as well as cartels do.
Thank you very much, Tim, and thank you, all of our panelists. We do have now around 15 minutes for questions, so I invite anybody from the audience to pass in front. Yes, please.
First of all, quiero agradecer a FIU.
First of all, I want to thank FIU.
Editors and publishers is reviving. from the former glory, and thank you very much.
I
I'm
have to
not.
invite them to dinner now.
Of course. I'm going to invite him to a wine tomorrow. The association is going to get a gathering, so you're all invited. I am very concerned of a few things you said here. And I feel that as a war correspondent for many years, when we were in school yet.
Could you please identify yourself?
Pedro Gonzalez, I'm the president of the Florida Association of Spanish Journalists. And as a war correspondent in Indochina, Africa, and Central America, I know a little bit about that. Professor Diament mentioned something very interesting, independent media. And I think in the case of Florida specifically, maybe you remember on the Miami Herald, the Oscar Corral article about 7 or 8 years ago, the federal government paying journalists of the Herald to write and publish in radio and TV Marti. And now here in FIU, they're training independent journalists in Cuba, paid by the federal government to do the same thing. We have our taxpayers' money doing that kind of things. And I want to ask Professor Diament, what is you think is the involvement of the federal American government paying journalists, not only here in the US, but also in Latin America for propaganda? Because I live in Florida, so it's not a question of Venezuelan government killing journalists, and they are doing that. It's a military dictatorship, as they have in Cuba now. But the point is this, how the federal government is becoming more and more involved. And let's mention the example of USA Today. Some contractors from the Army trick people from USA Today, an editor and a reporter, to publishing false things. So how do you think is that involvement?
Okay, let me first clarify the thing about the journalists in the Herald. The fact is that some journalists who were working for Radio Marti were also working for the Herald. If you work for Radio Marti, which is a federal dependence of, you are being paid by the US government. And the conflict of interest was that some of these journalists who were being paid for working at Radio Marti were also working at the Herald. It's not that they were getting money from the government, under the table. This was a practice that was known by everybody, that there were people who were working by Radio Marti or TV Marti were working also for the Herald, and suddenly it burst for reasons that are not clearly known. And so this is that particular incident. If you are working for Radio Marti or for America, what is the name of the Voice of America, you are being paid by the government. I don't have any knowledge of the US government paying Latin American journalists nowadays. It happened in the past. But I don't know if this is a practice, and I don't know if this is a legal practice from the point of view of the U.S. government.
Well, if I can add something, Mario, into that question. Part of the development of Latin American media or Latin American ONGs regarding press freedom organizations or issues are being part of what Washington or the US government calls promotion of democracy. That's the philosophy. The problem I found out is that 90% of the funding of that money that could go to journalism and media to develop and to train journalists to be better journalists in Latin America goes strictly to Cuba. Not only for Voice of the America, not only for Radio Marti, but also to independent journalists, and with a minimal result. And maybe the US government should think about supporting other actors of the media, like in Colombia or in Argentina, in Chile, where they are already working on making democracy better, to have a more impact with that money. But that money is part of what is called from the US Department. Is coming also from the National Endowment for Democracy and many other sources from the US government.
I would say that I prefer if the US government keeps the money for themselves and not spreads it in journalists in Latin America, whatever the endeavor, because it always becomes very suspicious.
Or giving more sources to National Public Radio, or that kind of thing.
And another thing, if I may add, it is the role of the Latin American governments who use the money from their own advertising to support loyal media. It happens all over Latin America. And I always claim that it is not the role of a government to do advertising. There is nothing for them to publish advertising in newspapers and television. They can go and give press conferences if they want to let people know what they are doing. I don't know if that answers your question, but I
just wanted to know because
We need a mic because of the translators, please.
my question goes to something that is very interesting because the involvement, and that's part of one of my work and in the masters I'm doing now, the involvement of the federal government more and more, and the repression in the press in the U.S. or the freedom of information that was mentioned here by Carlos previously, and I think that's why I said this is a luxury panel here. Because in this same building, we have a center for about, I don't know, $20 million from the Department of State to train independent journalists, and he is saying, and I agree with Mr. Trotti, and that was mentioned in the Congress of the Society, la Sociedad Interamericana de Prensa, the National Press Society, that money, 90% goes to the Cuban government, feeding them, computers, phones, and stuff like that. And this center is here, in the same building. So why we are using resources from our money, taxpayers' money, yours, mine, and everybody, in order to train people, and we are supporting something like that? Because, as you said, keep your money. Okay, but we can use that money for better things, like train journalists, get grants so people can come here and study. We have here, you have a master's in Spanish. What's going on with that? is canceling their master's in Spanish because we don't give grants to students from Latin America to come here and have a master's and things like that. That's a better use for that money.
Okay, let me see if I can briefly answer that. I think that the U.S. government sees itself as a defender of democracy in the world, and in some ways, in some periods, it was. So if you have a starting movement of independent journalists in Cuba, and they need some help, and they need some training, who's going to give them that training? So the U.S. government saw in its own interest to foster democracy or so-called democracy in Cuba to invest money in training independent journalists who otherwise wouldn't be able to do that. Is that good? Is that bad? I don't know. I think that it's important, and I personally participated in the training of independent journalists. And I think that I would do that not only in Cuba, I would do that everywhere, if I can prepare people to respond journalistically in a democratic society. So it's a question that we have to think about, if this is the role of the government. Every government that invests money in some place that has to do with the media has obviously a political agenda, and one has to be very careful with that.
Eduardo?
Eduardo Gamarra, un profesor en...
Eduardo Gamarra, a professor in the Department of Policy.
Great start to J&E. I'm really surprised by the questions that were just asked because, you know, I frankly came to this panel to listen to what's happening in Latin America. And I thought that in a sense, you know, the questions were going to be more about where are things right now. So what I'd like to ask you is to take it out of Florida, out of the United States. I think we all know what the situation is of the press in the United States with Fox News and the wonderful superstars now that we have in the media that are more concerned about their personalities than actually covering the news. So we all know that, those debates we've had in the United States. But I think that much of what's happening in Latin America with the media, some of the really interesting stuff that's happening is happening in Latin America. NTN, for example, is a very interesting example of an entrepreneurial group that now has coverage throughout the Americas, and I think you're in your third or fourth year. But at the same time, we can't see Telesur in the United States, for example. All right. So you know, we've got these interesting contradictions. So what I'd like to ask is something that I heard this morning from Maria Corina Machado. And I want to apply it to the case of Ms. Gurisatti and NTN. You know, she was appalled, and as is Lopez, who's in jail, at the lack of international response to the plight of this democratic opposition in Venezuela. At the same time, I'm sort of surprised by the lack of support that an organization like NTN 24 appears to have received from democratic journalists throughout the Americas. And you know, so Ricardo, as you know, your organization has been so involved in this. How much does a group like NTN 24, you know, I mean, what kind of a support structure might you develop to really speak for these kinds of groups from Latin American journalists? And by the way, from the perspective of American journalists, I haven't heard, except for in Miami, anybody really taking up the cause of democratic journalism in the region. So,
Claudia, do you want to address?
Muchas gracias.
Yeah, thank you. We have had, after the case of our century in Venezuela,
and of the freedoms from the journalists and the expression. Obviously, this is part of the nature of these groups that are for that, but it is true that there has been a silence that has very much of impact on the part of the governments of Latin America, that they say that they are the ones that are the leaders of the democratic values in the region. Even governments that in other occasions have been very critical to the Venezuelan government or regime, however you want to see it. I think that we are also under circumstances under which the same polarization that has been generated, this new expansionist strength of the socialism of the century 21, it's a capacity of organizing the strength of the hemisphere. We have seen, for example, how the impact of the Venezuelan case in the OAS is different to the multilateral organizations UNASUR, that's Confederation of Latin American Countries, that was created by Lula Silva when he was the president of Brazil when Chavez left, and he is the one that sponsored that. And then Corina Maria Machado comes, and there is a show of dimensions that any Democrat of the region would to be scared, but there's a permanent silence in UNASUR. The government of Venezuela goes and manages that all the president of all the cancilleres of UNASUR were present, and all of them asked to talk with the dissident voices. We do not know what happened. The next Thursday they're going to deliver a declaration, but clearly a recomposition of the strength. And now that I was listening to the presentation of Tim, it called my attention that why or up to what points the coverage on the part of the journalists in Latin America always depends on the degree of interest that the same government of the United States places on the things of Latin America. Up to what point, if the present government would really is interested in the reorganization of the strengths of the things in the region, how Venezuela has been little by little taking these votes of the OAS, thanks to the oil it has. If the United States thinks to do something about it, take that leadership, what's the interest of the U.S. in the region? And it also covers what journalists do for Latin America. I asked the question, and I do not know in NT24. We are very interested in cover from a region to bring this to the United States, to the Latins in in the United States. This is a different perspective. They don't cover the Latin American news only from the vision of the United States, but to bring all this from the optic of Latin America. Thank you very much. Brevemente.
Why the U.S. and international media haven't haven't been more preoccupied with the Venezuelan. There are three factors, Eduardo, that I think I would point out. One is that this protest movement in Venezuela simply had the bad luck of exploding on the scene at the same time Ukraine was exploding on the scene. And Ukraine was, fairly or not, a much more compelling narrative for international journalism because it was actually involving the overthrow of a regime. The violence was much worse. All the factors, cynical or otherwise, that draw foreign media to, like moths to a light, were simply there in the Ukraine and that weren't necessarily there in Venezuela. Number two, the U.S. government, back to the point that she just made about how sometimes we too often let ourselves be led by Washington's reaction to this. Washington has not really been forceful about Venezuela because I think they're realizing that one of their best weapons against Chavez when he was in power was not responding to Chavez. And they don't want to give Maduro a lot of fodder to build this. This is all just a fascist U.S. conspiracy to overthrow the socialist regime in Venezuela. And so, if we don't see Obama getting worked up about Venezuela in that regard, the U.S. media perhaps, will tend to be a little. But I think the third and perhaps most important thing, it's been really hard for the U.S. media or the international media to figure out what are the objectives of this protest movement. So far, they've been very ambiguous, very amorphous. Is it to overthrow the regime? Is it to get the regime to pursue economic and social reforms more seriously? We simply don't know what this protest movement's aim is. And Maria Corina Machado is not helping, to tell you the truth. She never really has been that helpful in her career as an opposition politician. And so we're really not getting a lot of direction that would help us develop the kind of narrative that you would, that you're perhaps asking for. So those three factors are not helping.
We have little time, so I will ask Emilio to be very brief in his question and also the answers we're going to have. Emilio, please.
Mi nombre es Emilio Palacio, soy periodista ecuatoriano.
My name is Emilio Palacio. I'm a journalist from Ecuador. I'm going to talk in Spanish, so excuse me. I have 60 years of age, and I lived during the problems of El Salvador and the problems in Ecuador and also in Argentina. I was in Salvador also, and I remember that at that time, when they were killing people in Argentina, they will tell me, they must have done something. Those are terrorists. And what are we going to do? And El Salvador, when they killed Monsignor Romero, he's a friend of the terrorists. He's a friend of the communists. Now they're after journalists. And what they tell me it's that the press has always was a friend of the governments and of the powers and the oligarchies. And the press never said the truth. And now you're telling me that, well, what happens is that the opposition in Venezuela doesn't understand very well what is happening there. Perhaps it's the worst opposition of the world, but they are after it. They are persecuting it. They don't let them. They don't let them talk. They destroy their families. You know what it is to destroy your family? You have to defend that. I cannot get in that position of, oh, I wash my hands. You're bad. Well, they've done something. 30,000 dead in Argentina. The cadavers were in the river, and people were thought, oh, they must have done something. Of course, that the directors of the press in Latin America have been terrible. I have been independent journalist 40 years. And I know what is the economic power of the press. But when they are after the press, when they are after the journalists and the ones that wants to have an independent voice, then you cannot start look all the butts to one that wants to speak. What they do is that they have to defend them. Thank you very much, Emilio. Now you oblige me to conclude. Well, we're going to have one day, and I know you're going to have a very intense day to talk on these subjects, about these subjects. I want to conclude first, obviously, thanking the excellence of these presentations. Please give me the word for a minute. I'm going to answer you in Spanish. I think you are right. And I don't think anybody has referred, at least not me in this panel, in that way. What I referred to was to something else. We're talking about media and journalists, not victims. That the victims are or not a journalist doesn't take away the condition of victims. What we say is that we could direct that debate to two things: the freedom of the expression, not to be judging the quality of that expression, of the militancy of that expression, and the right of the citizens to be informed. And that is what I refer to. Why? Because it is important to realize also to which is the specific role of a journalist in a society, independently of his condition of being after. Because of the experience lived in Latin America in the 80s, we should not distinguish between a journalist when they are being persecuted with a regime, as is happening in Venezuela and happened in Chile. I don't think you have to be more a victim or not, one that works in a as a journalist, and we should defend all of them. And in some measure, I think we are being poor doing it. Yes, I'm in agreement with you. In Honduras, they're killing journalists a lot. And I think that we should all shout about it. Afterwards, we should ask ourselves the next question. Independently of the condition of victims, were they or not journalists? Were they doing their journalism? Because in many cases, the line is doubtful. In the first place, this is important to determine to what we are exposed to and who are exposed. In Honduras, one of the assassinated persons were ex-candidates to local deputy. Carlos Cero. Yes, I'll conclude. The spokesman for a very specific place and leader of the opposition in Honduras. This takes away the condition of victim. Does you have more right to do something to that person? No, of course not. But we have to know why he was being attacked, or we do not know how to protect ourselves. And I'm going to go very quickly to the Venezuelan case. One are indiscriminate attacks to the regime, and we have to signal and point out totally. And the other one is the condition of the press in Venezuela, because I have not seen in Venezuela, and I have not seen, I don't say that they don't exist, a serious investigation of corruption by the opposition. I have not seen against the regime, because the journal is the first victim. They are great journalists trying to do their job in Venezuela, but every time they have less space and less time, including in the opposition. So more or further on, that you have to point out that it's intolerable, this attitude of the Venezuelan regime and others against the freedom of expression. Also, we have to start thinking about the true quality of journalism and the right to report information that the Venezuelans have. Very few we know really which are the objectives of this protest that they are mentioned. Thank you very much, Carlos. I want to conclude now saying, a bit in response also to what Eduardo was stating. I think that in Latin America and in the world, the organizations of freedom of the press, the communication means, the universities that teach journalism, we are also responsible of not favoring and creating a good culture of freedom of expression. Everywhere, I think we can have sins. Nevertheless, I think that in Latin America, and knowing a bit the universities of Latin America, and especially being in this place where we can talk with students of journalism, I think there are several responsibilities. And one responsibility of the students of journalism and of the academy is the responsibility of teaching the freedom of the press, of teaching the freedom of expression, because that's the only way of creating culture, and that it doesn't happen that there is silence when we censor in T24, because the journalists think that that can happen to any means or media. That is a responsibility that is very intrinsic of the journalists that has to be taught in universities. Thank you very much to all of you. Thank you, panelists.